Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin daf lamed chet. Today's daf is sponsored by Art Gold in loving memory of Carol Joy Robinson, Karina Gola Bat Huda V'Yehuda Tzvi. My beloved bride of almost 50 years. Tomorrow Shabbat, we would have been married 50 years on the secular calendar. It's no accident that Joy was Carol's middle name. She brought joy to everyone who knew her. We're forever grateful to Hashem for dropping Carol into my life like an angel from the heavens on an Erev Shabbat of August in 1971. And I will love Carol forever. We are going to get started now with our daf. So do a quick review because it's important to understand the end of yesterday's daf before we move on. So I'm going to share a screen with a chart. Here we go. Okay, we have a case of an eved. An eved, a Caananite slave. Remember, let's review the rules. A Caananite slave becomes part of your household. He's considered owned by the Jewish owner. Everything about him is owned. He's owned to the extent that anything he makes goes straight to the master. He's basically considered the property of the master. Again, this is very hard for us to understand in a modern world because we don't have such a thing. And in fact, at a certain point, even way back then, they stopped the whole institution of Caananite slaves. But it did exist at a certain point, and it's a huge topic of discussion in many, many Gemaras. The other thing is the slave is basically allowed to mate with another fellow slave, a maidservant. Someone on the same status as them, not allowed to be with a Jewish woman. Okay, even though they are somewhat Jewish, right? They do a brit milah, they do like a pseudo conversion, okay? But they go to the mikvah, but they're not actually Jewish. When do they become Jewish? If they're freed. If they're freed, they become Jewish, and then they're basically a Jew, a full-fledged Jew. Okay, now the issue is, first of all, we're going to learn today why or where we learn that you're not supposed to free them. Okay, but there are certain circumstances where they get freed, and that's exactly what we're discussing in our Mishna. So if they get taken into captivity, we're going to have two opinions about what exactly this Mishna is talking about and two opinions within the Mishna itself. So someone who gets taken into captivity, they can be freed in two different kinds of ways. Someone could pay their way out so that they continue to be an eved. Someone could pay their way out so that they be a free person. So it all depends on what the intent of the person was and I guess what they said at the time. So according to Rashbag, it really doesn't make a difference. The person's going to go back to being a slave no matter what. But according to Tanakama, if Eved, they'll be an Eved still. If Ben Cholim, for a free person, they'll be free. And now the question is, number one, to who are they going to be an Eved to? And number two, what's the Tikkun Olam here? So according to Abaye, and the third question really is, was this before the owner gave up on ever getting their slave back or after the owner gave back on getting their slave back? So Abaye says it was before the owner gave up on getting the slave back. And therefore, he understands this whole Mishna as, if it's L'shum Eved, you free my slave, he goes back to being my slave because I never gave up my rights to him. If you freed him to be free, well, then he can't be mine because you freed him to be free. Okay? Number one, he can't be to you because you freed him to be free, not to be your slave, and not to me because and here's the Tikkun Olam. Really, he should be mine because it's very nice you freed him to be free, but he belongs to me. Well, comes in the Tikkun Olam and says, listen, if we say that that if you free him, he'll stay a slave, nobody will have motivation to free him. Because to free a slave nobody really wants, feels the need to free a slave. But if you want to free, so first of all, there could be two reasons for this. Number one, they might say, Michelle, he's your slave. You free him. If you want him to be your slave, you spend the money. Why should we spend the money to free your slave? Number two, he's not a full-fledged Jew. So maybe because of that, they don't feel this need. Once he's Jew, or they know that he'll become Jewish as soon as they free him, there might be more motivation. Rashbag says, no matter what, you stay a slave because I never gave up my rights. He's my slave. And there's no reason for that tikkun olam. Why is there no reason? Because there's a mitzvah liftot avadim. What do you mean? They are somewhat Jewish. They're owned by Jews. And therefore, all Jews actually have a mitzvah to free him. And therefore, there will be motivation. You don't need to provide incentive. So the tikkun olam according to Abaye is according to Tanakama in the case where you free him to be a free person. You free him to be a slave. No. You free him to be a free person, right? It actually works, even though theoretically it shouldn't work. Rava says this whole thing is after Yeush. And the takana is going to be totally different then because 100% he's not mine anymore. I've given up my rights to him. I don't think I'll ever get him back. So what happens? Number one, according to Tanakama, if I free him, l'shum eved, So if you free him, to be a slave, he'll be your slave because you bought him basically from the Gentile. If you freed him to be a free person, obviously he's not going to be anybody's slave because you freed him to be a free person and he doesn't belong to anyone. According to Rashbag, here comes in the Tikkun Olam. The Tikkun Olam in this case is Rashbag, is this part, which is, Rashbag says, no, he must stay a slave. And why is that? Because what Chizkiah said, we're worried that if you don't do that, people will basically, slaves will say, oh, this is a good ticket out. Let me go, let myself be taken into captivity. And that way I'll get freed. Hopefully someone will free me and I'll be free. Now there's two problems with this, or at least, again, they don't tell you all the details, so you have to kind of fill in. Either we're worried that we want to protect the slave because he is part of a Jewish household and he's supposed to keep mitzvot, and now he's going to end up being in captivity, and we don't want him to be in captivity, not being able to keep mitzvot and all that. We care about him. Or the other could be we care about the slave owner, and he's going to, right? Slave owners in general, our whole system that's based on the fact that we have slaves is going to break down because all the slaves are going to use this as an option, as an opportunity to get free. Number one, people won't have slaves. Number two, people will end up spending all this money to redeem slaves. So that's also another possibility about why it's such a problem. Then after we saw that, now we're in trying to understand how is it that when you purchase this, if you purchase my slave from this Gentile, how do you get rights? Like, let's say you did it l'shem avdut. According to the second opinion, what did we say? It becomes your slave. But how do you really purchase from them? According to Jewish law, they don't really have, how do they get ownership rights over this other person? Okay, now it's a little hard to understand this concept. It's kind of saying within Jewish law, we have rights to buy slaves, but Gentiles don't have rights to buy Gentile slaves. Well, they have rights to buy slaves, just not the same way we do. We can buy a slave and their whole body becomes ours, right? They're part of our, and I keep saying body because it's gufo in Hebrew. I'm trying to think of a better word, but basically we have full rights to everything of theirs. When a Gentile purchases a slave, and that's what we're going to see now, that's what we saw at the end of the daf, which is they have rights like any worker, meaning they're like a day worker for them. So they work during the day and they go home at night, and then they make their salary that they make, right? Or you bought them to so that you could get their proceeds. But other things you don't own them. They're not your property. And where do we see this? Because it says, and all these psukim are quoted on the sheet. You can also look them up. It's Vayikra chapter 25, if you want to look on Safari or somewhere else where you can see the English translation. We're going to quote a bunch of psukim from Vayikra 25, where it all talks about different categories of slaves. There's an Eved Ivri, there's an Eved, right, which we have a Jewish slave because someone couldn't pay their debt. They work for us. They have their own rules. Canaanite slaves have their own rules. And then there's a section that also talks about, we're going to get to, if some Jew becomes taken as a slave to a Gentile. Like, let's say I couldn't pay back a loan and I sold myself into slavery to a Gentile. So in the psukim about us having Gentile slaves, it says, you can buy them from the people, right? That's why they're called Caananite, from the people in the land of Israel, right? In Canaan. Atem konim mehem, I'm now at the top of our daf. V'lo hem konim mikem. They don't buy from you. V'lo hem konim ze mizeh. They can't purchase from each other either. In other words, again, this is in Jewish law. They could do whatever they want, right? But in our courts, this is how we view it. It wouldn't be a kinyan if they bought it from you, and they can't acquire from each other. Yachol lo yiknu zeh zeh. You would have thought they can't buy one from the other. Wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. They stop the brayta. They say, what do you mean? You might have thought lo yiknu zeh zeh. Ha'amarta, didn't you just say a second ago? Lo hem konim zeh mizeh. They can't buy one from the other. So how can you on the one hand say they can't buy one from the other, and then you say, well, you might have thought they can't buy one from the other, which sounds like you're going to continue and say they can't. That doesn't make any sense. So now they explain the brayta. Hachi kamar. This is the way you read it. Lo hem konim zeh mizeh legufo. They can't acquire each other, like I said, legufo, to be their property. Aval yachol. Again, it's hard to say this without, it's hard to, this concept of that slaves are your property. Okay, I'm putting it out there. Again, this was a different world and things worked differently then. And again, they abolished this at a certain point. So at least that helps us to feel better. Okay, well, they can't acquire, this was all what we were trying to prove. They can't acquire as property, but they can acquire the rights to have this slave work for them. How do we know this? Because I'm Marta Kavachomer. Now, I told you there was a section in the Torah that says, they can acquire us and we work for them. There is such a possibility within Judaism that we could work for a Canaanite owner, right? But they don't own us. It's just that they get all of our, whatever we make goes to them, or Maaseh Yadayim. So now they're going to make a kavachom. If they could acquire a Jew for Maaseh Yadayim, as we said, isn't it obvious then that they can acquire another Canaanite? So there you have it. A non-Jew can acquire a non-Jew, and that's learned from a kavachom, from the fact that they can acquire Jews. Of course, they can acquire Gentiles. So now they say, wait a minute, what was that pasuk talking about? When they can acquire Jewish slaves, they can acquire us if they pay money, right? And we wanted to use this to say that if a Gentile takes someone into captivity, we can buy him out from the person who is owned by now, which is the Gentile, the one who took him into captivity, the captor. Now, maybe the acquiring only works when they paid money. That sounds a lot more normal. Who's to say? And when we learn from those psukim, when you get sold to a Gentile, well, a Jew gets sold to a Gentile means sold. There was some money passing hands, or I owed money, so I got sold into slavery. That's not the same as I got taken as a captive. Who's to say that they can acquire by chazaka just by holding on to me, right? That gives them the rights to me. That seems right already a stretch. So Amar Papa, Ammon and Moab talu b'sichon. We can prove it from Ammon and Moab and Sichon. What are we talking about here? There's psukim in the Torah that say we're not allowed to conquer Ammon, we're not allowed to conquer Moab. Why is that? Because we can't conquer their lands because God gave them to Lot. If these are the daughters of Lot, the grandchildren of Lot from his daughters. They basically, that's their land. You can't capture it. What happened though? Historically, Sichon, Melech HaEmori, the Amorite king, he conquered lands from Ammon and Moab, and then we conquered it from Sichon. So what do you see? How did he conquer it? He didn't buy it. He captured it and then lived in it. And once it was lived in, we were allowed to conquer those lands because they were no longer the lands of Ammon and Moab. So what do you see here? Rights can get passed to Gentiles through chazaka. If it works with land, it must work with slaves as well. Well, that shows you that Gentiles can take over Gentile property, okay, whether it's land or slaves. But how do we know that they can take Jewish slaves, right? Dichtiv, through chazaka. It says, Bayesh mimenu shevi. It says here that another pasuk, the Canaanim came and took captives. The fact that they can take captives means they have rights to us. And therefore, we see that through chazaka, they can conquer us. Okay, and they can therefore take a slave. The slave can be theirs, and then someone can actually purchase it from them because they can only purchase it if it really belonged to them. So that was all a very long-winded way to prove how we get this. Moving on. Now we're going to have a contradiction. Rabbi Yochanan against Rabbi Yochanan. We haven't seen Rabbi Yochanan yet, so wait, hold off. Now we're going to see the first statement of Rabbi Yochanan and say that contradicts the way Rabbi Yochanan understands our Mishna. Amar Rav Shimon bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Eved shebarach mi beit hasurim. You have a slave who gets taken to jail, presumably by, let's say, the Gentile authorities. He runs away from jail, escapes from jail. Yatzal chirut, he goes free. V'lo od ela, and not only does he go free, and now this is something we're going to talk about throughout today, which is somebody might be free, meaning they're no longer the property of their original owner. But does that mean that they can marry a Jewish woman? Because remember, what does freedom mean? Freedom means you're a Jew, and then you can marry a Jewish woman. Before you get freed, you can't marry a Jewish woman. So yes, they're free, meaning the owner no longer owns the slave. However, but he needs an emancipation document in order to permit him to marry. So not only does he go free, but we force the master to give him an emancipation document so that he's free to marry. Otherwise, he can't marry anybody. He can't marry a slave woman because he's not a slave anymore. And he can't marry a Jewish woman. This is our classic. We've seen this other times where there we've talked about it, and we'll get to this case today again, about a half-half, someone who's half slave, half free. How do you get to be half slave, half free? You have two masters, one freed you, the other one didn't. So you worked for, this one 1 week a month, 2 weeks a month, and that one 2 weeks a month, or 1 day, or whatever it is. And then one frees you, the other one doesn't. So your status, your marital status is totally messed up. And we force the other one to free you so that you can actually go get married. We view marriage as a value, right? First of all, you're commanded in Pru Revu if you're a man and you have this commandment on you. If you're a woman, it's less of that issue, but it's more that it's just unpleasant to be in this kind of situation where you can't actually marry anybody for halachic reasons. So we forced him to. But what do you see here? He forced him to free in order to allow marriage. It shows that the two are not connected. Now, not everyone's going to agree with this. We'll see another opinion later of Shmuel, that once you're not in the domain of your owner, then you're actually automatically permitted to marry a Jewish woman. You don't need a special emancipation document. But many disagree with him, and we're going to see here Rabbi Yochanan, and we'll see Rav also. What's the contradiction with Rabbi Yochanan? So first he says, if you run away from jail, you go free. But then look at our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says, Rashbag Omel, Ben Kach Ben Kach Yishta. If you free this soldier from this slave from captivity, what will happen? He will be he won't go free. He'll go back to his original owner, right? Or whatever owner, right? Depends on which opinion you go by. But basically, he'll be enslaved. So now, Rabbi Yochanan. Now here comes the other statement of Rabbi Yochanan. This is a very famous statement of Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which is going to come up later in our Masechet as well. Anytime it says Rashbag in the Mishnah, we paskin like him. So anytime Rashbag disagrees with anyone, we always hold like Rashbag, except for 3 exceptions to the rule. Okay, I promise next time we get to this, we'll talk about what these 3 cases are. It's a really long daf, so I don't want to spend my time in it. But it will come up later in the Masechet on daf Ayin Daled. Okay, and then we'll get to that. But basically, those are the only 3 cases we don't hold like Rashbag. Everywhere else we hold like Rashbag. Okay, so now they say, so what's our issue? How could the slave who ran away goes free, and the slave who gets taken into captivity and freed remains a slave? That seems like a total contradiction. For Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rashbag in our Mishnah. And he says the other thing, they contradict each other. To which the Gemara answers, or actually raises first the question we're going to see. First, they say the question like this. Bishlama la Abaye. Now, remember what Abaye said. Our Mishnah is in a case, lifnei yeush. Before I decided I'm giving up on ever getting my slave back. Mokele lahai lifnei yeush. So he said the Mishnah is before I gave up my rights to the slave. And when the slave ran away from jail, why does he go free? Because let's think about it. Why does he go free? I already gave up my rights. I felt like I'm never getting this slave back. So if I think I'm never getting the slave back, then I no longer own him. This is what we call, it's like mafkir. It's like I made him ownerless. So when he runs away from jail, he doesn't belong to anybody. So that makes perfect sense. If the Mishnah says, no matter what, he's going to be a slave, that's only if I haven't given up my thoughts about ever getting him back. If I don't give up on him, then he actually still belongs to me. But if I thought I'll never get him back again, then he doesn't belong to me. And that's the distinction between the Mishnah and the Braita. Very simple. The Mishnah and Rabbi Yochanan's situation here with the jail. But the Rava, and here's really the question of the Gemara. Rava says the Mishnah was also after Yeush. Remember, and it's tikkun olam, you're going to have to be a slave. Why are you going to be a slave? Because we're worried that all the slaves will go and turn themselves into the authorities, right? And get themselves taken into captivity so that they'll go free. So the Rava, Damar la'achar Yeush, it's all after Yeush. Hashid Rabbi Yochanan to Rabbi Yochanan. Why in the case when he runs away from jail, does he go free? And in the case where he gets taken as captive, he stays and we free him, right? He basically stays a slave. So Amar l'charava, we're going to have a possible answer. Tamamai mishum dechizkiah. Now, what's the reason? The reason there where we said in the Mishnah, according to Rava, is because of Chizkiah, what I just said, because we're worried they're all going to turn themselves over to the authorities just to get out of being a slave. But what's our case here, Rabbi Yochanan's case? It's a guy who runs away from jail. Now, when you try to get out of jail, you know that you risk death. You know that those guys standing in jail with their guns, right? They'll shoot you if they see you running away from jail. He risked his life to get out of jail. You think this guy is going to turn himself in to become a captive? Of course not. Okay, so therefore there's no reason for the takana in this case. And that's a distinction between these two cases. And that's how we resolve the contradiction according to Rava. According to Abaye, there is no contradiction really, or you could say it's one's before Yesh, one's after Yesh. That's the resolution. But Rava, you'd have to say it's just the takana is not relevant in this case. So now we're going to have 3 stories of Caananite maidservants, each one kind of relating to a different kind of issue about a maidservant and freeing them and and that kind of thing. But we're going to hear the similarity between the three is they're all stories of maidservants that belong to rabbis. Ante demar Shmuel ishtabai. So the maidservant of Shmuel got taken into captivity. Parkua l'shum amta. So the people, not Shmuel himself, freed her to be a slave. Okay, this goes back to the Mishna, right? One of the options was you free her, you pay her way out in order to continue to be a slave. Vishadu alei. And what did they do? They sent her back to Shmuel. And they said, here's your slave back. We redeemed her. Here she is. Shalchule. They wrote a note that said, Anan kirashbag spiran. We hold like Rashbag that no matter what reason you free this person, they'll always go back to being a slave. So that's why we're giving her back to you. She belongs to you. But you, maybe you don't hold like Rashbag. Well, inami kirabanans dispirla. If you hold like the rabbis, well, we still have a solution because anan l'shum amata parkina laniale. When we freed her, we said we're buying, again, maybe freeing isn't the right word. When we redeemed her, we said we're redeeming you to be a slave. So we redeemed her to be a slave, which means she goes back to being your slave. Now remember, there were two options of whose slave does she become. She becomes Shmuel's slave or she's someone else's slave, right? The person who redeemed her. So they said, we redeemed her to be a slave and she's yours. Why? Because inu savru lifnei Yerushava. They thought that Shmuel hadn't given up his thoughts on getting her back. He hadn't given up yet hope. He thought, I'm getting her back. And therefore, when they redeem her to be a slave, remember that was what Abaye said. If it's before Yeush, then she'll go back to being his slave. And that's basically what they told him. Either, we hold like Rashbag, no matter what, she goes back to being your slave. And you, even if you hold like the rabbis, we freed her to be your slave, assuming that he didn't have Yeush. But Shmuel, it's not true. Lohi, that wasn't the case. La'achar Yeush hava. He had already given up hope. And therefore, what does Shmuel do with this woman? Shmuel, lo mebayadish tabude lo mishtabeba. Not only did he not make her a slave anymore, he said, you're a free woman. Not only did he say that, but he didn't even require her to get a get shipur. And this is what I said before. As we're going to see, Shmuel Latame, he goes consistent with his opinion. The Amar Shmuel hamafkir abdol yatzal. He says, this didn't even get to the case in our Mishna. This is just a classic case. If I make my slave ownerless, they go free. And Eino tzarich get shipur. And they don't even need to get shipur. Why do they not need to get shipur? Because he connects between the ownership of the owner. As soon as she's not his property anymore, or he's not your property, whether it's a female slave or a male slave, once they're not your property, the marriage stuff goes hand in hand with that. Okay, before we split and we said, well, you still have to give her a get shipur. He thinks that they all go hand in hand, and he's going to prove it from a pasuk. Shenemal. This is in the context of the Korban Pesach. Who eats the Korban Pesach? One of the things the slaves do is they eat the Korban Pesach because they're part of the family. So they eat the Korban Pesach as long as they got a Brit Milah. And who does this? An Eved Ish Mikna Kesef, the Eved of a man who was acquired by him with money. So the thing they're struggling with is why the Eved of a man? Eved Ish below Eved Isha. What if it was a slave owned by a woman? Women could own slaves. It wasn't maybe as common, but women could own slaves. Let's say the father gave her a slave for inheritance. So why would it say Eved Ish? Ella, what they say, what's an Eved Ish? Eved sheyesh lo reshut lerabo alav karoi Eved. If he belongs to an Ish, he's called an Eved. She'en lo reshut lerabo alav ein karoi Eved. As soon as he's not under someone else's domain, this Ish isn't above him because he's no longer his property. He's not an Eved anymore. He's a Jew. So basically, what do you see here? They're connected. According to Shmuel, once you're not part of a person's possessions, you're no longer an Eved at all. And you don't need any sort of emancipation document. So the main thing we learn from this story is, number one, someone with two things. Someone who makes his slave ownerless, which basically is Yeush, saying, I'll never get the slave back. There's all sorts of ways you could just say, I'm being mafkir you if I want. I'm making you ownerless. But in this case, it got stolen from him, taken into captivity. He said, I'll never get the slave back. The slave is free. And hand in hand with that goes his ability to marry anyone he wants and doesn't need any sort of emancipation document. That was story number one. So we're going to get back to Shmuel later because we're going to see Rav, who disagrees a bit with Shmuel on this and actually requires a get shipur for someone who's mafkir, their slave. Ante de Rabbi Abba bar Zutra ishtabah. Now we have the slave woman of Rabbi Abba, Bar Zutra, gets taken into captivity. Parkahu tarmuda'a, the shum'itata, a tarmudai guy. We have the tarmudaim in the Hanukkah. Ajtikla regam and a shuk is right the time of Hanukkah candles until the rigla de tarmudai, until the last of the tarmudaim leave the shuk. They were people say they were tree cutters and they were the last ones to leave the shuk. Anyway, leaving that issue aside, but that's where we saw this word before. So it was a guy from Talmud, place, and he basically redeemed her. So this Caananite slave maidservant who belonged to a Jew, basically gets redeemed by some other guy. He pays her way out in order to marry her. Now, the Jews didn't want her to marry, and Rabbi Abba didn't want her to marry this guy because she's Jewish, so to speak, right? She's, again, pseudo-Jew, right? So she's supposed to keep mitzvot and all that, which she's not going to be able to do it. She's married to this Talmudai guy. So Shachole Ledide, they said to Rabbi Abba, if you want to do the right thing, send her a get shiur. What is this going to do? So that's what the Gemara is going to ask. Hechidami, what's the case? Now, there's two possibilities they set up. One is they have an option to redeem her, and the other is they don't have an option to redeem her. Okay, there's two possibilities, and we're going to go through each one. If they can redeem her, why should he send her a get shiur? He should try to redeem her. If they can't redeem her, well, what's the point of sending her a get shiur? She's got this Talmudai guy who now owns her. What's it going to help? It's not going to do anything if he frees her. First of all, freeing her will make her Jewish. She's married to this Gentile guy now, or she's going to be. What's it going to do? So let's try to explain. We're going to explain according to both options. So first they say, La'olam dematzu parkela. They really can redeem her. So why is he going to send her a get shiur, which then turns her into a full-fledged Jew? What was the problem? People weren't trying to redeem her. This is what we saw in the Mishna. If she's a slave woman, they won't care so much. So what did they say? If you redeem her, she'll be Jewish, and then everybody will try to free her to get her away from this Gentile guy. So free her so that people will start, your classic GoFundMe campaign. They'll start a GoFundMe and everyone will put in money and they'll be able to redeem her. But if she's a slave woman, it's not going to work so well. Option number 2. There's really no option to redeem. This goes very interesting. You might be a little surprised by this, but again, it teaches you a little bit about the relationship with the Gentiles in those days. Once he sends her a get shiur, this guy will understand. This guy probably had no idea that she was a Caananite slave in a Jewish household. Once he sends her a get shiur that's going to reach this woman and she gets this emancipation document from a Jewish owner, this guy's going to say, oh, she was a slave for a Jewish man? Oh, I'm not interested in this woman. And he won't want to marry her. And then she'll be free to go back to you. So then they say, really? But don't they say, Haviva lehen, there's a very strange line. Behentan shel Yisrael yoter min neshotem. It's probably one of these exaggerated lines. But the Gentiles prefer Jewish animals, the animals of Jews, even more than they prefer their own wives. So basically, the Gentiles are interested in Jewish property, in Jewish. They'll want her more because she's a Jewish slave woman. She worked for Jews. So why would you say he wouldn't want her? To which they answer, very interesting answer, in public, they'll say, oh, we don't want Jewish maidservants. No way, no how. But in private, they might actually prefer someone who is a Jew or belonged to a Jew or something like that. It's a very weird Gemara, hard to know what exactly to do with this, but it was it's kind of like their perceptions of anti-Semitism almost, right? This is the way they understood the way the Gentiles perceived us. They really want our stuff, but they can't say so in public. It will make them look bad. So basically, this was a ploy to get the guy to not want to marry her. And then, by the way, once he doesn't want to marry her, he'll sell her for a lot less money because she's already, she's gone down in value, and it'll actually be even easier to redeem her. Okay, so that was story number 2, where we basically learned about it didn't really teach us so much. It just sort of told us the story and then tried to figure out how this all came about. Now we have another bit of a disturbing story. She was a maidservant in Pumbedita. Now, slave women weren't really designated to any man. So people abused her, right? They would sleep with her. She was like a kind of local prostitute who, I guess, probably didn't even take money for it, and they were just using her. because she wasn't really, belonging to anybody. So, and she had no one to really protect her. So Amar Abaye, and this is a very difficult line, if it weren't for the statement of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, that it's forbidden, you're basically not keeping a positive commandment, which we'll get to later today. If it weren't for that, I would basically force, if it were not for that, I would force the owner, that you see he cares, but he's not willing to go farther. He says, I would have said we force the owner to give her a get shiur and redeem her so that she'll be Jewish. And when she's Jewish, she'll go get married and she'll settle down and people will stop treating her like this. So, but the problem is that if I do that, and the slave owner is going to basically be going against this positive commandment of not freeing, of keeping your slaves, basically. So Ravina says, what are you talking about? This is actually permitted in this case because this is causing people to sleep around with this woman. So of course it's permitted in that circumstance, which is what you would have thought, right? It's definitely permitted here, he said. So now they say, why didn't Abaye think about this? And why didn't he think this was okay? And in fact, we're going to bring a case where they did do this kind of thing. There was a woman who was half slave, half free. We already discussed this. Turning now to Amabed, and they forced him to basically free the woman. Right? People were abusing her. They were, because she was ownerless, so they basically were sleeping around with her. So now what did they do? They freed this woman. So you see that there's precedent to do this. So why wouldn't Abaye do this? To which they answered, the cases aren't the same. This is because she wasn't, right? This is a classic case of chetzi. Remember what we said? This woman has no chance anywhere. She can't be with a slave and she can't be with a Jewish person. Because of that, they freed her. Okay, but and here's why, even if you say Abaye, you really can't understand why he didn't do this. But here they're saying there was another solution, and it just really wasn't used, but it should have been used, and they should have told the owner to do this. The owner of the slave woman should have designated her to a particular slave in his household and said, listen, you guys are designated, this is your mate, okay? And basically said, do that. And once he did that, naturally, the slave would have protected the woman. Okay, so basically we're saying that there was a solution here. So Abaye was suggesting some other solution and saying, I wish I could do the solution because that would allow the rabbis to get involved, right? To basically force him. But in this case, they couldn't really force him. They didn't have any mode in which to force him, but they basically say there was another solution that could have been used. Maybe they did eventually use it. I don't know. It's not clear. I would hope that they did. But basically, you can't allow the freeing of the slaves since we have an alternative. Now, you might say, this is crazy. You really should have freed her. And I would say that once you read on a little bit more, you're going to be more convinced that it really seems like it wasn't too difficult to be able to free slaves. There were heterim here, and it's going to be a little shocking, the example that they bring where they did just free a slave very easily. And you're going to think, why didn't they do it here? And it's really a good question. Again, it could be different people and different approaches to the whole subject. Because you're going to see it's really a bit of a subject of debate about how seriously we treat this not freeing your Gentile slaves. It's interesting because, and this is the daf where we really talk about it, because it's come up a bunch of times about this not freeing Gentile slaves. And here's where the real basic sugya is, like, where does it come from? Why can't we do it? And when are we allowed to do it? What's considered extenuating circumstances? Gufa. So now we're going back to this line that says you can't free slaves. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Here's the mitzvah aseh that you're going against, and this is on the psukim and the sheets I gave you in the study guide. La'olam behem ta'avodu. The pasuk says, right? You can, when you buy slaves from the locals that live in Israel, that's why they're called Caananite slaves. It then says forever they should work for you. So now they say meitive, but wait, how can you say over ba'aseh? Here's a story where they freed a slave. Maaseh, now remember, going against a mitzvah aseh is less bad than going against a negative transgression, right? Negative is don't do this. It never says don't do this. It says do this. So you're just not doing this. So it's viewed as something bad, but it's not as bad as a negative prohibition. But here's a contradiction. He goes into shul. There was no minyan. So what did he do? Here's the case where he very easily freed his slave. This is very famous. So he just frees his slave, and then immediately the slave counts as the 10th man for the minyan. Now you would think that the female maidservant was a lot worse than this case, okay? But again, different people, maybe different approaches. Anyway, he did it right away. So what do you see here? It obviously can't be a bitul aseh, right? He wasn't not keeping a positive commandment to just do this for the minyan purpose. To which the Gemara answers, no, mitzvah shani. This was for a mitzvah. The mitzvah of getting a minyan is so important, apparently, that you can even free a slave to do this. Now we get to a machloket about this whole thing that we've been seeing. The Shmuel said, tavodu is a commandment. You have to keep them forever, is actually a subject of debate. Tanu Rabbanan, Lo'olam behem ta'avodu, rishut, divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, this is just an option, meaning if you want, they can be your slaves forever, meaning they're yours. You can pass them down through inheritance, which also comes up in the psukim there, and they can always remain your slave. It doesn't mean you have to, and you have to keep them as slaves, right? This is our saving line here, that even though we don't hold this way, but Rabbi Ishmael says, no, this is just, if you want to, they can remain your slaves. Rabbi Akiva Omer Chova. Rabbi Akiva thought it was a chova. So now they say, Dilma Rabbi Lezer Savar Lakamand Amar Reshut. Why did you say that when he freed the slave, it was because it was a mitzvah and he was overriding this positive commandment in the Torah to keep another mitzvah? But maybe he just held it was only an option and you didn't have to keep your slave forever. So lo sakada taktatanya behedya. Well, that's because we have another source where it explicitly says Rabbi Lezer Omer Chova. He also holds it's obligatory. So you can't say that. I'm a rabbi. Now Rabbi comes, and he says the following thing. The following three things make people who are rich become poor. This means basically it's a way of saying God will punish you if you do these three things, like a way of saying, I want to stop people from doing these things. So you couch it in these terms of you'll get punished by God if you do this, right? We don't really, it kind of cringe when we hear people say this kind of thing. But again, this was a manner of speaking and people understood that this is how they did it. So now, these are three things that bring people down. What are they? Number one, mafkir, people who free their slaves. Okay, that's going to basically cause you to lose your money. People who go around and check their fields on Shabbos and see how everything's going. Right? That's not an appropriate thing to do on Shabbat. You can see these things are, right, doing inappropriate things with your property is going to make you lose your property. And the third is, this is an interesting one for those people who, go out and schmooze and maybe eat, have a kiddush while the rabbi's speaking. So this is basically saying anyone who makes a meal on Shabbat, specifically when the drasha happened on Shabbos afternoon, is basically, right, and saying the food is more important than the drasha, then going to learn is going to basically lose their money, right? Because again, they're valuing food over Torah. They're valuing material items, so they're going to lose their material items. So Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan, and here we're going to have proof for at least one of them. There were two families in Jerusalem. One made their meal on Shabbat, which during the time of the Beit Midrash. One made their meal on Erev Shabbat. We're going to talk in a minute what this is. And both their families were cut off. Okay, what exactly that means we don't know, but doesn't sound very good. This sounds quite harsh. Okay, maybe it means ne'ekru, like they lost their money, as the previous. In any case, what's this thing about Erev Shabbat? It's very interesting. So nobody really knows what this is. What does it mean you made your Suda on Leil Shabbat? So some people say, and this is interesting because I wouldn't have thought this, that the main meal was on Shabbat afternoon. And in order to avoid this whole thing of doing it at the time of the Beit Midrash, they switched the main meal to Friday night, and that was the wrong thing to do. Which is interesting because, right, we often make a more main meal on Friday night than Shabbat. Some people do, all different types of things people do, but to say it's not the main meal would be hard to say. Also, Kiddush is the central Kiddush is at night, not during the day. Some people say it means you have a big meal on Friday, which basically precludes you from having a big meal on Shabbat because you ate a lot on Friday. Right? I was thinking they have all these, in Israel, they have these Friday brunches, eat all you want. It's like, that's like saying this is not to be done on Friday. That's not what you're supposed to do on Friday, right? As opposed to the other people who are busy cooking in the kitchen all Shabbat and all Friday and basically end up nibbling and never actually really eat a full meal. That maybe is more in line with the halakha. Anyway, it's an interesting thing to think about. But moving on, because we have a long daf and there's still more to go. So Amar Rabba Amar Rav. Hamakdish Abdo Yatsa L'Chiyut. So just to summarize, because again, this is a quite complicated section, whole thing about how to treat slaves. Can we free them? Can we not free them? There clearly were different approaches. The one that becomes more prominent is the approach that you really shouldn't free your slaves. And I believe that there's a bit of, there, like even that case with Abaye didn't want to free the woman's slave, but Ravina said yes. So you see that there were different opinions. Not everybody thought, and in Abaye, at least they claimed there was some other solution to the problem. It wasn't that he didn't want to deal with the problem at all. He just felt that there was a better solution that would avoid going against this mitzvah aseh. Okay, but you see that there's a range of opinions and a range of, and the guy who freed for the minyan obviously was much more lenient about it, because even as much as you say minyan's important, it's clearly not, at the top of the list. Prostitution and sleeping around is much worse. So again, I think it's a matter of approach and how seriously they took this issue. And why I want to say this is because we've seen, and that's why we struggle with this, because all around the Gemara, there's all sorts of cases of people who free their slaves. So if it's really forbidden, then they shouldn't really be freeing their slaves. So how is it that this slave was freed, right? Like you have all these cases of a chetzio ben chorin and a chetzio eved, who freed him in the first place. And why did he free him in the first place? So again, there are circumstances where it's allowed. And again, it's, as usual, it's not black and white. Okay, there's all this gray area in between, and different people fall in different places of the gray area. Okay, moving on. Amar Rav. We're going to have a few different statements in the name of Rav. Hamakdish Abdo Yatsa L'Chiyut. This is our main topic for right now. If you sanctify your slave, what you really meant was to set him free. Okay, what's the connection? Usually you sanctify something that goes to the temple. Either you sanctify it itself, like an animal, or a curtain that you want to use in the curtain in the temple, or something like that. That's called the gufo, okay? Or you sanctify the value of it. You say, I'm bringing the value of this item. You don't bring the item, you just bring the value. And the item remains yours. But here he says, if you're makdish your slave goes free. What is this? My time. To which he says, gufe lo kaddish. Okay, well, the body of the eved has no purpose in the temple. You can't hang him on a wall. You can't put him on the altar. Okay, as much as maybe they were demeaning to slaves, that much we know you don't do to slaves. L'dame lo kamar, the value of it, you didn't say. If you said value, if you meant value, you would have said value. If you say your hekdesh, and you didn't say your value is hekdesh, then he distinguishes. He says, if you wanted to do value, you would have said value. You didn't say value. So what did you mean then? The only option is dilahave am kadosh kamar. You must have meant hekdesh. Oh, hekdesh has the root kadosh in it. You must have meant, I want you to be holy. What does it mean to be holy? I want you to be Jewish. It means I'm setting you free. That's the way he understands makdish. We're going to see that some people disagree with him. Rabbi Yosef said that Rav said not that, but Rav said, mafkir avdo yatsa l'chiyut. If you make your slave ownerless, like Rav said, like Shmuel had said, he goes free. So if you say, manda amar makdish, if you say Rav said makdish goes free, kol shekei mafkir, all the more so if you were made him ownerless. But manda amar mafkir, but if you said mafkir is what Rav said goes free, aval makdish lo dilma l'dame kamar. But you wouldn't say someone who's makdish, because you might say no, because the other option is that when you said makdish, really you meant l'dame, you just didn't say for value. Okay, and that's going to be the big problem with Rav. Why does he say makdish means part of the holy nation, and not what makdish usually means, which I'm giving your value to the temple? So I understand you didn't say I'm giving your value, but it still kind of sounds that way. So ibayelu, and we'll talk about this a lot more tomorrow, but somewhat in today's stuff too. Ibayelu, tzarich get shichur or lo tzarich? Do you need, in both these cases, when they say mafkir, makdish, do you need to get shichur? Now we already saw Shmuel said you don't. They go hand in hand. But Rav is going to say, Tashma amar Rav Chia bar Avin amar Rav, echad ze v'echad ze yatsa l'chiyut v'tzarich get shichur. They both go free, but you need to get shichur. Okay, whether mafkir, whether makdish, they go free, but it's not enough. It's only for monetary purposes. It's not enough to allow them to marry a Jew. You have to free them, give them an emancipation document to allow. Now we're going to start with the first two questions against Rav. I have another one at the end of the daf, but we'll leave that for tomorrow. I'm a Rav. I'm going to bring a question against Rav about this makdish yatsa l'chiyut. from a bright. If I give my property to the temple, and there were slaves among my property. The treasurers can't just say you're free. What do? They sell them to other people. They take the money goes to the temple. And then, if they want, they could be motziot al-chirut. Rabbi if he wants, he can actually, if he has money, he can pay his way out. He'll be a free man, and the money goes to the temple. So what do you see here? This is all ledame. It means that you sanctified him when you said makdish. And now what Rav says. To which the Gemara answers, Manita karamit later Rav. What? You're bringing it right to the question, Rav? Rav Tanahu Pali, very famous line. When they have no choice and they get stuck, that Rav doesn't fit in with a Tanaitic source, Rav is the only one who has this status. He can be considered like a Tana because he was the first Amora, and he has the rights. Okay, no one else has the rights to disagree with the Tanaitic source. You have to always answer it somehow. Rav has status. He can do. Second question, Tashma. Etc. This is if you make something cherem to the temple, it's a way of sanctifying something, either humans or animals. What kind of humans can you sanctify the temple? So what do you see here? You can sanctify them to the temple. Rav said if you sanctify them, you really mean I'm freeing them. So they say, oh, very simple answer. You can, what is cherem? When you say I'm giving their value, Rav's whole point was you didn't say I'm giving their value. You just said you're sanctified. If you said I'm giving your value to the temple, obviously you would be. And that way it doesn't contradict. To which the Gemara says, well, why don't you answer that to the first bright? But now they're going to prove the first bright couldn't have been that you said ledame. Because what does ledame mean? Ledame means basically your value is going to the temple, but the slave remains in the property of the original owner. He's just saying the value of this eved I'm giving to the temple. He has to write a check, right, and send it to the temple. So all these things then don't fit. What does it mean? It says the gizbarim can't free him, right? They could just sell him to someone else. What right? So this gizbar. This eved, if you said ledame for the value of the eved, doesn't belong to the gizbar. And vitu same question. If other people can purchase him, how could they purchase him from the gizbar, from the treasurer? The treasurer doesn't own him. And vitu Rabbi Yochanan, he can buy himself out. If you gave just his value and you said, I'm giving your value, again, he wouldn't be owned to the extent that he could buy his way out. So basically, you couldn't have answered that, and that's why they had no choice but to say Rav disagrees with this Tanaitic source. Okay, so quick review, even though it's really late, but it was a very long daf. But number one, we learned how we know an Oved Kochavim has rights to buy, purchase a Jew and a Gentile as a slave as a worker, not as a slave, really, but yes, as a worker. And therefore, when you redeem him, you're basically buying him. Then we went to this contradiction with Rabbi Yochanan. Eved that runs away from jail, goes free. How does that work with the fact that he passes like Rashbag in our Mishna? And we worked that out that there are two different situations, or either before Yehush, after Yehush, or running away is not the same as normal slave who might just turn himself in. Then we went to Shmuel, who basically says we had the three stories of the Amot, where we learned different things like Shmuel, if you make your slave ownerless, he doesn't belong to you, and you don't even need to give a get shiur, versus Rav, who we saw later, who thinks you do free him, but you do need to give him a get shiur in order to allow him to marry. We saw the woman who was to the Talmudai, and then we had to understand why they were trying to get him to give her a get shiur. Then we went to the one in Pumbedita, who people were taking advantage of, and the attempts they made to try to help her, even though they didn't really go as far as we would have liked. Then we saw what's the source of not being able to free a Canaanite slave, which again is something that comes up all over in the Gemara, so it's good to actually see it inside where it comes from. And then we saw how much the rabbis said, don't do this and don't do a few other things, and if you do, you'll lose your money. Then we went into this whole discussion about, did Rav say makdish abdo yetzal l'chirut, or did he say mafkir abdo yetzal l'chirut? And then we tried to understand, if you really said makdish abdo yetzal l'chirut, you didn't really mean this whole thing about I'm sanctifying you the temple. You really meant I'm making you a Jew. How does that work with these other sources? And we figured out either one Rav really disagrees with, and the other one we explained is a different scenario where he actually said I'm giving your value. If he says I'm giving your value, obviously he means that. Question is, what if he just said makdish? Tomorrow we'll get into more about this. Is Adam Motzi Dvarav Levatala? That's the next line. Anyway, that will be in tomorrow's Shiur, so I'll leave it for now. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and Yeah, that was a heavy daf, a complicated daf in terms of, just the concepts to accept the way we view slaves in that time. But again, you always have to remember that these things have to be understood within a context, okay? And with that, we'll finish for today. Shabbat shalom.